Welcome to Sleep to Divine Egypt, Gods, Temples, and Creation. In this video, you'll explore the fascinating world of ancient Egyptian deities, their temples, and the creation myths that shaped a civilization. Have you ever wondered how the gods influenced daily life in ancient Egypt? What secrets lie within the temples dedicated to these divine beings? As we journey through Chapter 2 of History of Egypt, Chaldaea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, you'll uncover the mysteries of the feudal gods, the powerful triads, and the cosmogonies that defined their beliefs. This video combines soft-spoken narration, calming visuals, and gentle soundscapes to create a soothing experience perfect for bedtime or study. If you enjoy immersing yourself in the divine stories of antiquity, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more tranquil explorations into ancient history. Let's begin our journey into the divine. Part 2. The Gods of Egypt. The incredible number of religious scenes found among the representations on ancient Egyptian monuments is, at first glance, very striking. Nearly every illustration in works by Egyptologists shows us the figure of some deity receiving, with an impassive face, the prayers and offerings of a worshipper. One would think that the country was inhabited mostly by gods, with just enough men and animals to satisfy the needs of their worship. On entering this mysterious world, we are confronted with an actual rabble of gods, each of whom always possessed only a limited and almost unconscious existence. They individually represented a function, a moment in the life of man or of the universe. Thus, Naprit was identified with the ripe ear or the grain of wheat. Musconit appeared by the child's cradle at the very moment of its birth, and Raninit presided over the naming and nurturing of the newborn. Neither Raninit, the fairy godmother, nor Musconit exercised over nature as a whole that sovereign authority we usually consider the primary attribute of deity. Every day of every year, one was spent easing the pains of women in childbirth, and the other in choosing an auspicious name for each baby, one that would later serve to ward off bad luck. As soon as their tasks were done in one place, they hurried to another, where an approaching birth demanded their presence and care. From childbed to childbed they passed, and if they fulfilled the single offices in which they were considered experts, the pious asked nothing more of them. Bands of mysterious cynocephali haunting the eastern and western mountains focused all their activity on one fleeting moment of the day. They danced and chattered in the east for half an hour to greet the rising sun, just as others in the west hailed him as he entered night. It was the duty of certain genii to open gates in Hades, or to keep the paths the sun traveled daily. These genii were always at their posts, never free to leave them, and had no other ability than to punctually fulfill their assigned duties. Their existence, generally unnoticed, was suddenly revealed at the moment when the specific acts of their lives were about to be completed. Once these were done, the divinities fell back into their state of inertia and were, so to speak, reabsorbed by their functions until the next occasion. Scarcely visible even in glimpses, they were not easily depicted. Their real forms are often unknown. These were roughly guessed from their occupations. The character and costume of an archer or of a spearman were given to those who roamed through Hades to pierce the dead with arrows or javelins. Those who prowled around souls to cut their throats and hack them to pieces were represented as women armed with knives, carvers, donit, or else as lacerators, nokit. Some appeared in human form, others as animals, bulls or lions, rams or monkeys, serpents, fish, ibises, hawks. Others lived inanimate things, such as trees, sistrums, stakes stuck in the ground. And lastly, many showed a mixed origin in their combinations of human and animal forms. These latter would be regarded by us as monsters. To the Egyptians, they were beings, perhaps rarer than the rest, but no less real, and the like might be encountered in the vicinity of Egypt.
How could men who believed themselves surrounded by flesh and blood sphinxes and griffins doubt that there were bull-headed and hawk-headed divinities with human busts? The existence of such paradoxical creatures was proven by much authentic testimony. More than one hunter had distinctly seen them as they ran along the furthest plains of the horizon beyond the herds of gazelles he was chasing. And shepherds feared them for their flocks as truly as they feared the lions or the great felines of the desert. This nation of gods, like nations of men, contained foreign elements whose origin was known to the Egyptians themselves. They knew that Hathor, the milk cow, had lived in their land since very ancient times, and they called her the Lady of Puanit, after the name of her native country. Bisu followed her in time and claimed his share of honors and worship alongside her. He first appeared as a leopard, then he became a man clothed in the skin of a leopard, but of strange countenance and alarming character, a big-headed dwarf with high cheekbones and a wide open mouth from which hung an enormous tongue. He was at once jovial and martial, a friend of dance and battle. In historical times, all nations subjugated by the pharaohs transferred some of their principal divinities to their conquerors. The Shahadadi of Libya was enthroned in the valley of the Nile, just as the Semitic Balu and his retinue of Astartes, Anites, Ashefs, and Pajus were. These divine colonists fared like all foreigners who sought to settle on the banks of the Nile. They were quickly assimilated, shaped, molded, and made into Egyptian deities scarcely distinguishable from those of the old race. This mixed pantheon had its ranks of nobles, princes, kings, and each of them represented one of the elements making up the world or one of the forces regulating its government. The sky, the earth, the stars, the sun, the Nile, these were all breathing and thinking beings, whose lives were daily manifest in the life of the universe. They were worshipped from one end of the valley to the other, and the whole nation agreed in proclaiming their sovereign power. But when the people began to name them, to define their powers and attributes, to specify their forms or the relations among them, this unanimity ended. Each principality, each nome, each city, almost every village conceived and represented them differently. Some said that the sky was the great Horus, Haroris, the sparrowhawk of mottled plumage that hovers in the highest air and whose gaze embraces the entire field of creation. Due to a punning similarity between his name and the word Haru, which designates the human countenance, the two senses were combined. To the idea of the sparrowhawk was added that of a divine face, whose two eyes opened in turn, the right eye being the sun to give light by day, and the left eye the moon to illuminate the night. The face also shone with a light of its own, the zodiacal light, which appeared unexpectedly, morning or evening, a little before sunrise and a little after sunset. These luminous beams, radiating from a common center hidden in the heights of the firmament, spread into a wide pyramidal sheet of liquid blue, whose base rested on earth, but whose apex was slightly inclined towards the zenith. The divine face was symmetrically framed and attached to earth by 4 thick locks of hair. These were the pillars that supported the firmament and prevented its collapse. A no less ancient tradition dismissed as fables all tales told of the sparrowhawk or of the face and taught that heaven and earth are married gods, Sibu and Nenit, and from whose union came forth all that has been, all that is, and all that shall be.
Most people imagined them in human form and depicted the earth god Sibu as stretched out beneath Nuit, the starry one. The goddess stretched out her arms, stretched out her slender legs, stretched out her body above the clouds, and her disheveled head drooped westward. But there were also many who believed that Sibu was hidden under the form of a colossal gander, whose mate once laid the sun egg, and perhaps still laid it daily. From the piercing cries with which he congratulated her and announced the good news to all who cared to hear it, in the manner of his kind,
he had received the flattering epithet of Nagu Oiru, the Great Cackler. Other versions rejected the goose in favor of a vigorous bull, the father of gods and men, whose companion was a cow, a large-eyed Hathor of beautiful countenance. The head of the good beast rises into the heavens. The mysterious waters that cover the world flow along her spine. The star-covered underside of her body, which we call the firmament, is visible to the inhabitants of earth, and her 4 legs are the 4 pillars standing at the 4 cardinal points of the world. The planets, and especially the sun, varied in form and nature according to the prevailing conception of the heavens. The fiery disk Atonu, by which the sun revealed himself to men, was a living god, called Ra, as was also the planet itself. Where the sky was regarded as Horus, Ra formed the right eye of the divine face. When Horus opened his eyelids in the morning, he made the dawn and day. When he closed them in the evening, the dusk and night were at hand. Where the sky was seen as the incarnation of a goddess, Ra was considered her son, his father being the earth god, and he was born again with every new dawn, wearing a sidelock and with his finger to his lips, as human children were conventionally represented. He was also that luminous egg, laid and hatched in the east by the celestial goose, from which the sun bursts forth to fill the world with its rays. Nevertheless, by an anomaly not uncommon in religions, the egg did not always contain the same kind of bird. A lapwing or a heron might emerge from it, or perhaps, in memory of Horus, one of the beautiful golden sparrowhawks of southern Egypt. A sunhawk hovering in high heaven on outstretched wings at least presented a bold and poetic image. But what can be said for a sun-calf? Yet it is under the innocent aspect of a spotted calf, a suckling calf of pure mouth, that the Egyptians were pleased to describe the sun-god, when Sibu, the father, was a bull, and Hathor a heifer. But the prevalent conception was that in which the life of the sun was likened to the life of man. The 2 deities presiding over the east received the orb upon their hands at its birth, just as midwives receive a newborn child, and cared for it during the first hour of the day and of its life. It soon left them, and proceeded under the belly of Nuit, growing and strengthening from minute to minute until at noon it had become a triumphant hero whose splendor is shed abroad over all. But as night comes on, his strength forsakes him, and his glory is obscured. He is bent and broken down, and heavily drags himself along like an old man leaning upon his stick. At length he passes away beyond the horizon, plunging westward into the mouth of Nuit, and traversing her body by night, to be born anew the next morning, again to follow the paths along which he had travelled on the preceding day. A first bark, the Saktit, awaited him at birth, and carried him from the eastern to the southern extremity of the world. Mazit, the second bark, received him at noon and bore him into the land of Manu, which is at the entrance into Hades. Other barks, with which we are less familiar, conveyed him by night, from his setting until his rising in the morning. Sometimes he was supposed to enter the barks alone, and then they were magic and self-directed, having neither oars nor sails nor helm. Sometimes they were equipped with a full crew like that of an Egyptian boat, a pilot at the prow to take soundings in the channel and forecast the wind, a pilot astern to steer, a quartermaster in the middle to transmit the orders of the pilot at the prow to the pilot at the stern, and half a dozen sailors to handle poles or oars. Peacefully the bark glided along the celestial river amid the acclamations of the gods who lived upon its shores. But occasionally a popy, a gigantic serpent like that which hides within the earthly Nile and devours its banks, came forth from the depth of the waters and arose in the path of the god. As soon as they caught sight of it in the distance, the crew flew to arms and began the struggle against him, with prayers and spear thrusts. Men in their cities saw the sun faint and fail, and sought to help him in his distress. They cried out, they were beside themselves with excitement, beating their breasts, sounding their musical instruments, and striking with all their strength on every metal vase or utensil in their possession, that their clamor might rise to heaven and terrify the monster. After a time of anguish, Ra emerged from the darkness and again went on his way, while Apopi sank back into the abyss, paralyzed by the magic of the gods and pierced with many wounds.
Apart from these temporary eclipses, which no one could foretell, the Sun King steadily followed his course around the world, according to laws which even his will could not change. Day after day he made his oblique ascent from east to south, then to descend obliquely towards the west. During the summer months, the obliquity of his course diminished, and he came closer to Egypt. During the winter, it increased, and he went farther away. This double movement recurred with such regularity from equinox to solstice, and from solstice to equinox, that the day of the god's departure and the day of his return could be confidently predicted. The Egyptians explained this phenomenon according to their conceptions of the nature of the world. The solar bark always kept close to that bank of the celestial river which was nearest to men, and when the river overflowed at the annual inundation, the sun was carried along with it outside the regular bed of the stream, and brought yet closer to Egypt. As the inundation abated, the bark descended and receded, its greatest distance from earth corresponding with the lowest level of the waters. It was again brought back to us by the rising strength of the next flood, and, as this phenomenon was yearly repeated, the periodicity of the sun's oblique movements was regarded as the necessary consequence of the periodic movements of the celestial Nile. The same stream also carried a whole crowd of gods, whose existence was revealed at night only to the inhabitants of earth. At an interval of 12 hours, and in its own bark, the pale disk of the moon, Yahu Auhu, followed the disk of the sun along the ramparts of the world. The moon also appeared in many various forms. Here as a man born of Nuit, there as a cynocephalus or an ibis. Elsewhere it was the left eye of Horus, guarded by the ibis or cynocephalus. Like Ra, it had its enemies incessantly upon the watch for it, the crocodile, the hippopotamus, and the sow. But it was when at the full, about the 15th of each month, that the lunar eye was in greatest peril. The sow fell upon it, tore it out of the face of heaven, and cast it, streaming with blood and tears, into the celestial Nile, where it was gradually extinguished and lost for days. But its twin, the sun or its guardian, the cynocephalus, immediately set forth to find it and to restore it to Horus.
No sooner was it replaced than it slowly recovered and renewed its radiance. When it was well, Uzait, the sow, again attacked and mutilated it, and the gods rescued and again revived it. Each month there was a fortnight of youth and of growing splendor, followed by a fortnight's agony and ever-increasing pallor. It was born to die and died to be born again 12 times in the year, and each of these cycles measured a month for the inhabitants of the world. One invariable accident from time to time disturbed the routine of its existence. Benefiting from some distraction of the guardians, the sow greedily swallowed it, and then its light went out suddenly instead of fading gradually. These eclipses, which alarmed mankind at least as much as those of the sun, were scarcely more than momentary, the guards compelling the monster to cast up the eye before it had been destroyed. Every evening the lunar bark issued out of Hades, by the door which Ra had passed through in the morning, and as it rose on the horizon, the star lamps scattered over the firmament appeared one by one, giving light here and there like the campfires of a distant army. However many there might be, there were as many indestructibles, Akimu Soku, or unchanging ones, Akimu Urdu, whose charge it was to attend upon them and watch over their maintenance. They were not scattered at random by the hand which had suspended them, but their distribution had been ordered in accordance with a certain plan, and they were arranged in fixed groups like so many star republics, each being independent of its neighbors. They represented the outlines of bodies of men and animals dimly traced out upon the depths of night, but shining with greater brilliance in certain important places. The 7 stars, which we liken to a chariot, Charles's Wain, suggested to the Egyptians the haunch of an ox placed on the northern edge of the horizon. 2 lesser stars connected the haunch, Maskait, with 13 others which recalled the silhouette of a gigantic hippopotamus, Ririit, erect upon her hind legs and jauntily carrying upon her shoulders a monstrous crocodile whose jaws opened threateningly above her head. 18 luminaries, of varying size and splendor, forming a group hard by the hippopotamus, indicated the outline of a gigantic lion couchant, with stiffened tail, its head turned to the right and facing the haunch. The lion is sometimes shown as having a crocodile tail. According to Biot, the Egyptian lion has nothing in common with the Greek constellation of that name, nor yet with our own, but was composed of smaller stars belonging to the Greek constellation of the Cup, or to the continuation of the Hydra, so that its head, its body, and its tail would follow the sinuosities of the Hydra between the Hes and the Yis of that constellation, or the Yis of the Virgo. Most of the constellations never left the sky. Night after night they were to be found almost in the same places, and always shining with the same even light. Others, carried by a slow movement, passed annually beyond the limits of sight for months at a time. At least 5 of our planets were known from all antiquity, and their characteristic colors and appearances carefully noted. Sometimes each was thought to be a hawk-headed Horus. Ubshe-thotwi are Jupiter, Kahari, Saturn, Subku, Mercury, steered their barks straight ahead like Yahu and Ra. But Mars, Doshiri, the red, sailed backward. As a star, Bonu, the bird, Venus, had a dual personality. In the evening it was Ueti, the lonely star which is the first to rise, often before nightfall. In the morning it became Tiunatiri, the god who hails the sun before his rising and proclaims the dawn of day. Sahu and Soptit, Orion and Sirius, were the rulers of this mysterious world. Sahu consisted of 15 stars, 7 large and 8 small, so arranged as to represent a runner darting into space, while the fairest of them shone above his head and marked him out from afar to the admiration of mortals. With his right hand he flourished the crux ansata, and turning his head towards Sothis as he beckoned her on with his left, seemed as though inviting her to follow him. The goddess, standing scepter in hand and crowned with tall feathers surmounted by her most radiant star, answered the call of Sahu with a gesture and quietly embarked in pursuit, as though in no anxiety to overtake him. Sometimes she is represented as a cow lying down in her bark, with 3 stars along her back and Sirius flaming from between her horns. Not content to shine by night only, her bluish rays suddenly darted forth in full daylight and without any warning, often described upon the sky the mystic lines of the triangle which stood for her name. It was then that she produced those curious phenomena of the zodiacal light, which other legends attributed to Horus himself.
One, and perhaps the most ancient of the innumerable accounts of this god and goddess, represented Sahu as a wild hunter. A world as vast as ours rested upon the other side of the iron firmament. Like ours, it was distributed into seas and continents, divided by rivers and canals, but populated by races unknown to men. Sahu traversed it during the day, surrounded by genii who presided over the lamps forming his constellation. At his appearance, the stars prepared themselves for battle, the heavenly archers rushed forward, the bones of the gods upon the horizon trembled at the sight of him, for it was no common game that he hunted, but the very gods themselves. One attendant secured the prey with a lasso, as bulls are caught in the pastures, while another examined each capture to decide if it were pure and good for food. This being determined, others downed the divine victim, cut its throat, disemboweled it, cut up its carcass, cast the joints into a pot, and superintended their cooking. Sahu did not devour indifferently all that the fortune of the chase might bring him, but classified his game in accordance with his wants. He ate the great gods at his breakfast in the morning, the lesser gods at his dinner towards noon, and the small ones at his supper. The old were rendered more tender by roasting. As each god was assimilated by him, its most precious virtues were transfused into himself. By the wisdom of the old was his wisdom strengthened, the youth of the young repaired the daily waste of his own youth, and all their fires, as they penetrated his being, served to maintain the perpetual splendor of his light. The gnome gods who presided over the destinies of Egyptian cities and formed a true feudal system of divinities belonged to one or the other of these natural categories. In vain did they present themselves under the most shifting aspects and the most deceptive attributes. In vain did they disguise themselves with the utmost care. A closer examination generally disclosed the principal features of their original physiognomies. Osiris of the Delta, Khnumu of the Cataract, Harshapfitu of Heliopolis, were each of them incarnations of the fertilizing and life-sustaining Nile. Wherever there was some important change in the river, there they were more especially installed and worshipped. Khnumu at the place of its entering into Egypt, and again at the town of Harit, near the point where a great arm branched off from the eastern stream to flow toward the Libyan hills and form the Bahar Yusuf. Harshapfitu at the gorges of the Fayum, where the Bahar Yusuf left the valley, and, finally, Osiris at Mendes and at Busiris, towards the mouth of the middle branch, which was held to be the true Nile by the people of the land. Isis of Buto denoted the black vegetable mold of the valley, the distinctive soil of Egypt annually covered and fertilized by the inundation.
But the earth in general, as distinguished from the sky, the earth with its continents, its seas, its alternation of barren deserts and fertile lands, was represented as a man, Ta at Memphis, Amon at Thebes, Menu at Coptos and at Panopolis. Amon seems rather to have symbolized the productive soil, while Menu reigned over the desert. But these were fine distinctions, not invariably insisted upon, and his worshippers often invested Amon with the most significant attributes of Minu. The sky gods, like the earth gods, were separated into two groups, the one consisting of women, Hathor of Dendra, or Nid of Sais, the other composed of men identical with Horus or derived from him, and Huri-Shu of Sebennytos and Thynis, Harmarati, Horus of the two eyes, at Pharbethos, Harsapti, Horus the source of the zodiacal light, in the Wadi Tumulat, and finally Harhudidi at Edfu. Ra, the solar disk, was enthroned at Heliopolis, and sun gods were numerous among the gnome deities, but they were sun gods closely connected with gods representing the sky, and resembled Horus quite as much as Ra. Whether under the name of Horus or of Enhuri, the sky was early identified with its most brilliant luminary, its solar eye, and its divinity was, as it were, fused into that of the sun. Horus the sun, and Ra, the sun god of Heliopolis, had so permeated each other that none could say where the one began and the other ended. One by one all the functions of Ra had been usurped by Horus, and all the designations of Horus had been appropriated by Ra. The sun was styled Harmoquidi, the Horus of the two mountains, that is, the Horus who comes forth from the mountain of the east in the morning, and retires at evening into the mountain of the west, or Hartma, Horus the pikeman, that Horus whose lance spears the hippopotamus or the serpent of the celestial river, or Harnubi, the golden Horus, the great golden sparrowhawk with mottled plumage, who puts all other birds to flight, and these titles were indifferently applied to each of the feudal gods who represented the sun. The latter were numerous. Sometimes, as in the case of Harkabi, Horus of Kobiu, a geographical qualification was appended to the generic term of Horus, while specific names, almost invariably derived from the parts which they were supposed to play, were borne by others. The sky god worshipped at Thynis in Upper Egypt, at Zeret and at Sebennytos in Lower Egypt, was called Onuri. When he assumed the attributes of Ra, and took upon himself the solar nature, his name was interpreted as denoting the conqueror of the sky. He was essentially combative. Crowned with a group of upright plumes, his spear raised and ever ready to strike the foe, he advanced along the firmament and triumphantly traversed it day by day. The sun god who at Metamorph Tod and Ermont had preceded Amon as ruler of the Theban plain, was also a warrior, and his name of Montu had reference to his method of fighting. He was depicted as brandishing a curved sword and cutting off the heads of his adversaries. Each of the feudal gods naturally cherished pretensions to universal dominion, and proclaimed himself the suzerain, the father of all the gods, as the local prince was the suzerain, the father of all men, but the effective suzerainty of god or prince really ended where that of his peers ruling over the adjacent nomes began. The goddesses shared in the exercise of supreme power, and had the same right of inheritance and possession as regards sovereignty that women had in human law. Isis was entitled Lady and Mistress at Buto, as Hathor was at Dendra, and as Nid at Sais, the firstborn, when as yet there had been no birth. They enjoyed in their cities the same honors as the male gods in theirs, as the latter were kings, so were they queens, and all bowed down before them. The animal gods, whether entirely in the form of beasts, or having human bodies attached to animal heads, shared omnipotence with those in human form. Horus of Hebonus swooped down upon the back of a gazelle like a hunting hawk, Hathor of Dendra was a cow, Bastet of Bubastis was a cat or a tigress, while Nekabit of El-Kab was a great bald-headed vulture. Hermopolis worshipped the ibis and cynocephaly of Thot, Oxyrhynchus the mormorous fish, and Ombos and the Phaeum a crocodile, under the name of Sabku, sometimes with the epithet of Azai, the brigand. We cannot always understand what led the inhabitants of each nome to affect one animal rather than another. Why, towards Greco-Roman times, should they have worshipped the jackal, or even the dog, at Siut? How came Sit to be incarnate in a fennec, or in an imaginary quadruped? Occasionally, however, we can follow the train of thought that determined their choice. The habit of certain monkeys in assembling as it were in full court, and chattering noisily a little before sunrise and sunset, would almost justify the as yet uncivilized Egyptians in entrusting cynocephaly with the charge of hailing the god morning and evening as he appeared in the east, or passed away in the west.
If Ra was held to be a grasshopper under the Old Empire, it was because he flew far up in the sky like the clouds of locusts driven from Central Africa, which suddenly fell upon the fields and ravaged them. Most of the Nile gods, Khnumu, Osiris, Harshafitu, were incarnate in the form of a ram or of a buck. Does not the masculine vigor and procreative rage of these animals naturally point them out as fitting images of the life-giving Nile and the overflowing of its waters? It is easy to understand how the neighborhood of a marsh or of a rock-encumbered rapid should have suggested the crocodile as supreme deity to the inhabitants of the Fayum or of Ombos. The crocodiles there multiplied so rapidly as to constitute a serious danger. There they had the mastery and could be appeased only by means of prayers and sacrifices. When instinctive terror had been superseded by reflection and some explanation was offered of the origin of the various cults, the very nature of the animal seemed to justify the veneration with which it was regarded. The crocodile is amphibious, and Sobku was supposed to be a crocodile because before the creation the sovereign god plunged recklessly into the dark waters and came forth to form the world as the crocodile emerged from the river to lay its eggs upon the bank. Most of the feudal divinities began their lives in solitary grandeur, apart from, and often hostile to their neighbors. Families were assigned to them later. Each appropriated 2 companions and formed a trinity, or, as it is generally called, a triad. But there were several kinds of triads. In nomes subject to God, the local deity was frequently content with 1 wife and 1 son. But often he was united to 2 goddesses, who were at once his sisters and his wives, according to the national custom. Thus, Thot of Hermopolis possessed himself a harem consisting of Seshahit Safhitabui and Hachmaut. Tumu divided the homage of the inhabitants of Heliopolis with Neb-Thokpit and with Usasit. Khnumu seduced and married the 2 fairies of the neighboring cataract, Anukt the constrainer, who compresses the Nile between its rocks at Fils and at Syena, and Satit the archeress, who shoots forth the current straight and swift as an arrow. Where a goddess reigned over a nome, the triad was completed by 2 male deities, a divine consort and a divine son. Neat of size had taken for his husband Osiris of Mendes, and bore him a lion's whelp, Ari Hos Nonfer. Hathor of Nandra had completed her household with Harueres, and a younger Horus with the epithet of Ahi, he who strikes the sistrum. The persons united with the old feudal divinities in order to form triads were not of the same class. Goddesses especially were made to order, and might often be described as grammatical. So obvious is the linguistic device to which they owe their being. From Ra, Ammon, Horus, and Sobkus, female Ras, Ammonites, Horuses, and Sobkunites, were derived by the addition of the regular feminine affix to the primitive masculine names, Reite, Ammonite, Horite, and Sobkite. In the same way, detached cognomen of divine fathers were embodied into divine sons. Imotpu, he who comes in peace, was merely one of the epithets of Ptah before he became incarnate as the 3rd member of the Memphite triad. In other cases, alliances were contracted between divinities of ancient stock, but natives of different nomes, as in the case of Isis of Buto and the Mendesian Osiris, of Haroeris of Edfu, and Hathor of Dendera. In the same manner, Soket of Letopolis and Bastit of Bubastit were appropriated as wives to Ptah of Memphis, Nofertumu being represented as his son by both unions. These improvised connections were generally determined by considerations of vicinity, The gods of conterminous principalities were married as the children of kings of two adjoining kingdoms are married to form or to consolidate relations, and to establish bonds of kinship between rival powers whose unremitting hostility would mean the swift ruin of entire peoples. The system of triads, begun in primitive times and continued unbrokenly up to the last days of Egyptian polytheism, far from anyway lowering the prestige of the old feudal gods, was rather the means of enhancing it in the eyes of the multitude. As powerful lords as the newcomers might be at home, it was only in the strength of an auxiliary title that they could enter a strange city, and then only on the condition of submitting to its religious law. Hathor, supreme at Dendera, shrank into insignificance before Haroeres at Edfu, and there retained only the somewhat subordinate part of a wife in the house of her husband. On the other hand, Haroeres, when at Dendera, descended from the supreme rank and was nothing more than the almost useless consort of the lady Hathor. His name came first in the invocations of the triad because of his position therein as husband and father, but this was simply a concession to the propriety of etiquette, and even though named in second place, Hathor was nonetheless the real chief of Dendera and of its divine family. Thus, the principal personage in any triad was always the one who had been patron of the nome prior to the introduction of the triad. In some places, the father god, and in other places, the mother goddess. The son in a divine triad had of himself limited authority. When Isis and Osiris were his parents, he was generally an infant Horus, naked, or simply adorned with necklaces and bracelets. A thick lock of hair depended from his temple, and his mother, squatting on her heels or else sit-in, nursed him upon her knees, offering her breast to him. Even in triads where the son was supposed to have attained to man's state, he held the lowest place, and there was enjoined upon him the same respectful attitude towards his parents as is observed by children of human race in the presence of theirs. He took the lowest place at all solemn receptions, spoke only with his parents' permission, acted only by their command, and as the agent of their will. Occasionally he was vouchsafed a character of his own, and filled a definite position, as in Memphis, where Imhotpu was the patron of science. But generally he was not considered as having either office or marked individuality. His being was but a feeble reflection of his father's, and possessed neither life nor power except as derived from him. Two such contiguous personalities must have been confused, and as a matter of fact were confused, so as to become at length nothing more than two aspects of the same God, who united in his own person degrees of relationship mutually exclusive of each other in human families. Father, as much as he was the first member of the triad, son by virtue of being its third member, identical to himself in both capacities, he was at once his own father, his own son, and the husband of his mother. Gods, like men, might be resolved into at least two elements, soul and body. But in Egypt the conception of the soul varied in different times and in different schools. It might be an insect, butterfly, bee, or praying mantis, or a bird, the ordinary sparrowhawk, the human-headed sparrowhawk, a heron or a crane, whose wings enabled it to pass rapidly through space, or the black shadow, and is therefore free and irradiated and then free and wear-and-turned into light sunlight. Finally, it might be a kind of light shadow, like a reflection from the surface of calm water or from a polished mirror, a living and colored projection of the human figure, a double reproducing in minutest detail the complete image of the object or person to whom it belonged.
The soul, the shadow, the double of a god, was in no way essentially different from the soul, shadow, or double of a man. His body, indeed, was molded out of a more rarefied substance, and generally invisible, but endowed with the same qualities, and subject to the same imperfections as ours. The gods, therefore, on the whole, were more ethereal, stronger, more powerful, better fitted to command, to enjoy, and to suffer than ordinary men.
But they were still men. They had bones, muscles, flesh, blood. They were hungry and ate. They were thirsty and drank. Our passions, griefs, joys, infirmities were also theirs. The sa, a mysterious fluid, circulated throughout their members and carried with it health, vigor, and life. They were not all equally charged with it. Some had more, others less, their energy being in proportion to the amount which they contained. The better supplied willingly gave of their superfluity to those who lacked it, and all could readily transmit it to mankind, this transfusion being easily accomplished in the temples. The king, or any ordinary man who wished to be thus impregnated, presented himself before the statue of the god and squatted at its feet with his back towards it. The statue then placed its right hand upon the nape of his neck, and by making passes caused the fluid to flow from it and to accumulate in him as in a receiver. This rite was of temporary efficacy only, and required frequent renewal in order that its benefit might be maintained. By using or transmitting it, the gods themselves exhausted their sa of life, and the less vigorous replenished themselves from the stronger, while the latter went to draw fresh fullness from a mysterious pond in the northern sky called the Pond of the Sa. Divine bodies, continually recruited by the influx of this magic fluid, preserved their vigor far beyond the term allotted to the bodies of men and beasts. Age, instead of quickly destroying them, hardened and transformed them into precious metals. Their bones were changed to silver, their flesh to gold, their hair, piled up and painted blue, after the manner of great chiefs, was turned to lapis lazuli. This transformation of each into an animated statue did not altogether do away with the ravages of time. Decrepitude was no less irremediable with them than with men, although it came to them more slowly. When the son had grown old, his mouth trembled, his driveling ran down to earth, his spittle dropped upon the ground. None of the feudal gods had escaped this destiny. For them, as for mankind, the day came when they must leave the city and go forth to the tomb. The ancients long refused to believe that death was natural and inevitable. They thought that life, once begun, might go on indefinitely. If no accident stopped it short, why should it cease? And so men did not die in Egypt. They were assassinated. The murderer often belonged to this world and was easily recognized as another man, an animal, some inanimate object such as a stone loosened from the hillside, a tree which fell upon the passerby and crushed him. But often, too, the murderer was of the unseen world, and so was hidden, his presence being betrayed in his malignant attacks only. He was a god, an evil spirit, a disembodied soul that slyly insinuated itself into the living man, or fell upon him with irresistible violence, illness being a struggle between the one possessed and the power which possessed him. As soon as the former succumbed, he was carried away from his own people, and his place knew him no more. But had it all ended for him with the moment in which he had ceased to breathe? As to the body, no one was ignorant of its natural fate. It quickly fell to decay, and a few years sufficed to reduce it to a skeleton. And as for the skeleton, in the lapse of centuries, that too was disintegrated and became a mere train of dust, to be blown away by the first breath of wind. The soul might have a longer career and fuller fortunes, but these were believed to be dependent upon those of the body and commensurate with them. Every advance made in the process of decomposition robbed the soul of some part of itself. Its consciousness gradually faded until nothing was left but a vague and hollow form that vanished altogether when the corpse had entirely disappeared. From an early date, the Egyptians had endeavored to arrest this gradual destruction of the human organism, and their first effort to this end naturally was directed towards the preservation of the body, since without it, the existence of the soul could not be ensured. It was imperative that during that last sleep, which for them was fraught with terrors, the flesh should neither be decomposed nor turned to dust, that it should be free from offensive odor and secure from predatory worms. They set to work, therefore, to discover how to preserve it. The oldest burials which have yet been found prove that these early inhabitants were successful in securing the permanence of the body for a few decades only. When one of them died, his son or his nearest relative carefully washed the corpse in water impregnated with an astringent or aromatic substance such as natron or some solution of fragrant gums, and then fumigated it with burning herbs and perfumes that were destined to overpower, at least temporarily, the odor of death. Having taken these precautions, they placed the body in the grave, sometimes entirely naked, sometimes partially covered with its ordinary garments, or sewn up in a closely fitting gazelle skin. The dead man was placed on his left side, lying north and south, with his face towards the east. In some cases on the bare ground, in others on a mat, a strip of leather, or a fleece, in the position of a child in the fetal state. The knees are sharply bent at an angle of 45 degrees with the thighs, while the thighs are either at right angles with the body or drawn up so as to almost touch the elbows. The hands are sometimes extended in front of the face, sometimes the arms are folded and the hands joined on the breast or neck. In some instances, the legs are bent upward in such fashion that they almost lie parallel with the trunk. The deceased could only be made to assume this position by a violent effort, and in many cases the tendons and the flesh had to be cut to facilitate the operation. The dryness of the grounds selected for these burial places retarded the corruption of the flesh for a long time, it is true, but only retarded it, and so did not prevent the soul from being finally destroyed. Seeing decay could not be prevented, it was determined to accelerate the process by taking the flesh from the bones before interment. These bodies thus treated are often incomplete. The head is missing, or is detached from the neck and laid in another part of the pit, or, on the other hand, the body is not there, and the head only is found in the grave, generally placed apart on a brick, a heap of stones, or a layer of cut flints. These precautions preserved the firmer parts of the human frame, but the Egyptians judged the price too high. A body stripped of its flesh was not merely reduced in bulk, it lost unity and continuity. It was rarely a perfect skeleton with its parts in place, but a heap of bones without connecting links. When embalming left a body dismembered, the ancient restorers attempted an artificial reconstruction in the tomb. Bones were laid in order, feet at the bottom, then legs, trunk, arms, and finally the skull. Yet fear of the dead, especially of one treated so roughly, sometimes led the living to make that restoration deliberately incomplete. If they reassembled the skeleton at all, they might omit setting the head, or remove one or more vertebrae, so the deceased could not rise to bite and harass the living. Still, they doubted whether a soul could enjoy existence if only half the body remained. They wanted to preserve flesh as well as bone. They had noticed that corpses buried in the desert sand dried quickly. Skin hardened into a dark parchment, the flesh wasted away beneath, and the frame appeared intact. The integrity of that visible body seemed to secure the soul. So men tried to reproduce the conserving action of sand by artificial means. They kept the body whole, desiccating it without mutilation to achieve that apparent incorruptibility. This art was ascribed to Anubis, the jackal lord of sepulture. The god cleansed the body of its viscera, those parts that decay fastest, saturated it with salts and aromatics, wrapped it first in an animal hide, then in thick layers of linen. Yet the bath of salts did not preserve the soft parts entirely. Much of the flesh dissolved or shrank. What remained was so desiccated that the bulk of the body was considerably diminished. After this process, a man emerged a mere skeleton, draped with tightly drawn skin, shriveled limbs, a sunken chest, grinning features, yellow and blackened skin freckled by the embalmer's salts. This was not the man as he had lived, but a caricature of him. Nonetheless, as he was now secure against immediate destruction, the Egyptians said he retained his shape. He had been purged of what was evil and could face, with tolerable assurance, whatever lay ahead. The art of Anubis, passed down to embalmers, by removing most of what decayed while keeping outward appearance, arrested putrefaction for an indefinite period, if not forever. When hills were available, mummies were born there partly by custom and partly because dry air and soil aided preservation. In the delta, where hills were distant, the smallest sandy islet rising above the marshes became a cemetery. Where none of these options existed, the mummy was entrusted to the soil only after being enclosed in a hard stone sarcophagus, its lid and trough sealed with cement to keep out moisture. Assured on that point, the soul followed the body into the tomb and dwelt there as in an eternal house, on the frontier between visible and invisible worlds. The soul preserved the character it had on earth. As it had been a double before death, so it remained a double after death. It could move, go, come, speak, breathe, and accept pious homage, but without pleasure, mechanically, more from an instinctive horror of annihilation than from any noble desire for immortality. Unceasing regret for the bright world it had left haunted this inert existence. O my brother, withhold not thyself from drinking and from eating, from drunkenness, from love, from all enjoyment, from following thy desire by day and by night. Put not sorrow within thy heart, for what are the years of a man upon earth? The West is a land of sleep and of heavy shadows, a place wherein its inhabitants, once installed, slumber on in their mummy forms, nevermore waking to see their brethren, nevermore to recognize their fathers or their mothers, with hearts forgetful of their wives and children. The living water which earth giveth to all who dwell upon it is for me but stagnant and dead. That water that is mine, since I came into this funerary valley, I know not where nor what I am. Give me a drink of running water. Let me be placed by the edge of the water, with my face to the north, that the breeze may caress me, and my heart be refreshed from its sorrow. By day, the double remained hidden within the tomb. If it issued forth at night, it was not for longing for past pleasures. Its organs still needed nourishment. It possessed but hunger for food, thirst for drink. Want drove it from the tomb among the living. It prowled like a marauder through fields and villages, picking up and devouring whatever it found, discarded meats, household and stable refuse, and if these failed, even dung and excrement. This ravenous presence had no misty shroud like our modern phantoms. It had a precise shape, naked or clad in the garments it had worn in life, and emitted a faint light, hence the name luminous, ku. The double would not let its family forget it. It entered houses and even people's bodies, terrified them by sudden apparitions, struck them with disease or madness, and could even suck their blood like a vampire. There was one sure means to escape or prevent these visitations. Take to the tomb the provisions the double required. Funerary sacrifices and the cult of the dead began from the need to supply the manes with food after their bodies had been mummified. Gazelles and oxen were brought and slain at the door of the tomb chapel. Haunches and heart and breast were presented and heaped so that the dead might find them when hunger came. Vessels of beer or wine, jars of fresh water treated with natron or perfumed, were set out so that they might drink their fill. By such offerings, the living purchased the goodwill of the dead, just as in life one might placate a powerful neighbor. The gods shared these wants and perils. Their bodies, too, suffered change and perished. Their souls, being representatives of their bodies, faded unless measures were taken to halt decay. The same need that drove men to seek durable sepulture compelled the gods to the same remedy. At first they were buried in the hills, and were called those who are upon the sand, safe from putrefaction. Later, when embalming was known, the gods themselves were mummified. Each nome kept the mummy and tomb of its dead god. At Tinis, the mummy of Anhuri; at Mendes, the mummy of Osiris; at Heliopolis, the mummy of Tumu. In some places, gods retained their names in death. Osiris remained Osiris. Neet and Hathor remained Neet and Hathor. But Ptah of Memphis became Sokaris by dying. Wapuit Uti, the jackal of Siut, was changed into Anubis. And when Anhuri's disk set in the evening, Anhuri, the sunlit sky of Tinis, became Contenmentit, lord of the west, until the next day. The gods did not gain bliss in the world to come. Their bodies were inert larvae, with unmoving heart, weak, shriveled, unable to stand were it not that bandages stiffened them into a rigid block. Only their hands and heads were free, and these showed the green or black hue of putrefaction. Their doubles, like human doubles, both dreaded and regretted the light. Hunger extinguished sentiment. Gods noted for compassion in life became pitiless and fierce in the tomb. When men stood before Sokares, Contenmentit, or Osiris, mortals trembled and dared not look the god in the face. None spared those who loved him. He bore away a child from its mother, an old man on his way. All creatures made supplication, but he turned not his face. Only the unfailing payment of tribute could avert his fury, feeding him as though he were a human double. The living paid by pomp and yearly sacrifices. The dead paid more dearly for the protection he granted. He bartered prayers, sepulchral meals, and offerings addressed to the dead. Nothing reached a double directly without first passing through him. When friends wished to send wine, water, bread, meat, vegetables, or fruit, he required that they be formally offered to him. He then prayed to transmit them to the named double. He took possession, kept part, and gave the remainder. Thus the feudal relation endured. The worshipper who had called himself the Amaku of the god in life remained the subject and vassal of his mummied god in death.
The god dwelt in this city alongside the prince and among his subjects. Ra at Heliopolis with the prince of Heliopolis. Heroi at Edfu with the prince of Edfu. Neet at Sais with the prince of Sais. The name of the temple in the language of the time shows what it originally was: a feudal mansion, height, or house, Peru, P, of the god.
It was better cared for and more respected than the houses of men, but was not otherwise unlike them. Temples were built on a slight rise to be safe from the inundation. Where no natural mound existed, a rectangular platform of earth was raised. A layer of sand on the subsoil prevented settlement or infiltration and formed a bed for the foundations. Within the temple there were mats, low tables of stone, wood, or metal, a few utensils for cooking offerings, and vessels for blood, oil, wine, and water, with which the god was daily regaled. As provisions for sacrifice grew, so did the temple's rooms. Chambers for flowers, perfumes, fabrics, precious vessels, and food clustered around the primitive abode until that original dwelling became merely the sanctuary. There the god lived not only in spirit, but in body. The fact that he belonged to several cities did not prevent his being present in all of them at once. He could divide his double and transmit it to as many bodies as he pleased, human or animal, natural or manufactured, such as statues of stone, metal, or wood. Several gods were incarnate in rams, Osiris and Mendes, Harshafichu at Heliopolis, Gnumu at Elephantine. Living rams were kept in their temples. Other gods entered bulls, Ra at Heliopolis, later Ptah at Memphis, Minu at Thebes, and Monthu at Hermenthus. The gods indicated by certain marks the beasts they intended to animate. One who recognized those signs could find a living deity when needed and present it to the worshippers. If statues lacked the outward animation of living beasts, they nonetheless concealed an intense life within their rigid forms. On occasion, that energy showed by gesture or word. Statues could indicate in terms their servants understood the will of the god or his opinion on current events. They answered questions according to prescribed forms and sometimes foretold the future. Each temple held many statues, each an embodiment of the local divinity or a member of his triad. These secondary figures shared in a lesser degree the honors and prerogatives of the chief god. They accepted sacrifices, answered prayers, and prophesied when needed. They occupied the sanctuary, one of the halls around it, or isolated chapels subject to the feudal god. The god had his divine court to aid him in ruling his dominions, just as a prince is helped by his ministers in governing his realm. These official rites and state theology were elaborate, but they did not exhaust the piety of the people. Everywhere, unofficial divinities sprang up, casual, local, beloved. An unusually tall palm in the desert, a rock of strange shape, a spring that dripped from a mountain where hunters slaked their thirst, a great serpent that haunted a field or ravine, any such thing might become an object of worship. Peasants brought these shrines bread, cakes, and fruit, believing that to feed the snake or tend the tree would bring heaven's blessing upon their fields. Along the edge of the cultivation, and even out on the sand, single sycamores often flourish as if by miracle. Their fresh green stands out against the fawn-colored plain. Their dense foliage defies the midday sun. Yet dig a little, and one finds they drink from Nile water that seeps underground. The trees stand, as it were, with their feet in the river, though none suspect it. Egyptians of every rank treated these trees as divine. They made daily offerings, figs, grapes, cucumbers, vegetables, and porous jars of water replenished by charitable passers-by. Those who drank returned thanks with a short prayer. Several such trees grew in the Memphite and Heliopolite nomes. From Deshura to Giza, these districts were known as the Land of the Sycamore, a name later applied to Memphis itself. Even today, the sacred trees of the countryside are still honored by Muslim and Christian fellahin. The most famous was the sycamore of the south, Nuhid Rist. regarded as the living body of Hathor on earth. Alongside official gods and prophetic statues, each nome claimed one or more sacred animals and one or more magic trees. Families and almost every individual kept household gods and fetishes too. Objects singled out by a chance encounter with an animal or a thing, by a dream or sudden intuition. These were placed in a corner or niche at home, lamps kept burning, small daily offerings, in addition to festival gifts. In return, they guarded the household, acted as counselors, and were invoked in every daily need. Their decrees were obeyed with the same scrupulousness that subjects paid to the feudal god. The prince stood as the great high priest. The religion of the nome rested on him. Originally, he performed its ceremonies personally. The principal rite was a sacrifice, conceived as a banquet which he prepared and presented with his own hands. He would go forth to lasso a half-wild bull, bind it, cut its throat, skin it, burn part of the carcass before the idol, and distribute the rest among his attendants with cakes, fruits, vegetables, and wine. At these moments the god was present both in body and double, clothed, perfumed, eating and drinking the best that was offered, and setting aside portions for future use. This was the time to make requests. Feasted and satisfied, the god was more likely to grant them. Yet the god was not without suspicion. He had lain down conditions in a sort of contract with his worshippers, conditions that, if faithfully observed, obliged him to fulfill his part. Above all, he demanded physical cleanliness. The officiating priest must wash, wabu, his face, mouth, hands, and body. From this purification came the priestly name Uibu, the washed, the clean.
The priest's costume was archaic and varied with occasion. At certain moments he wore sandals, a panther skin over his shoulder, and a heavy lock of hair over his right ear. At others he girded a loincloth with a jackal's tail, removed his shoes, or attached a false beard. The species, age, and hair of the victim, how it was to be bound and led, the exact manner of slaughter, the order of opening and cutting up the body, every detail was fixed and unchangeable. These were the least of the divine demands. Each sacrificial act had formulas, words whose precise sequence and rhythm might not be altered, even by the god, without losing efficacy. Ritual combined sound and movement. Chant, tone, and ordered gestures worked together. One false note, one misstep in gesture, any hesitation, these annulled the sacrifice. Worship thus became a legal transaction. The worshipper handed over property to the god's legal representatives as payment or atonement. If the innumerable conditions of the transfer were met, the god could not shirk his obligation. If they were not, the offering remained with the temple and the god was bound to nothing. This placed a grave responsibility on the officiating priest. A slip of memory, the slightest accidental impurity, made him a bad priest, harmful to himself and to those who entrusted him with their petitions. Because no prince could be expected to keep up such ritual perfection while managing state affairs, professional priests were associated with him, men who devoted their lives to the 1,000 formalities comprising the local religion. Each temple had its corps of priests, separate from neighboring temples, ranked in a learned hierarchy, and led by a sovereign pontiff. In some places he was called the first prophet or the first servant of the god, Honnut Topi. At Thebes, the first prophet of Ammon. At Thinis, the first prophet of Anhuri. Often the title suited the god. The chief priest of Ra, at Heliopolis, was Oyirumau, master of visions. He alone, besides the sovereign, might enter the sanctuary, and enter into heaven, and there behold the god face to face. The high priest of Anhuri at Sibinitos bore the title Wise and Pure Warrior, Ahuiti Sao Wibu, because his god bore arms, and a soldier god needed a soldier for his pontiff. These great priests did not confine themselves to ritual.
The gods accepted, and sometimes solicited, houses, fields, vineyards, orchards, slaves, and fish ponds, whose produce supported temples. Every Egyptian desired to leave such a legacy to his patron god as a monument to himself and an endowment for perpetual prayers and sacrifices. Over time, these gifts became sacred estates, hotpun nutia, akin to the wakofs of later Muslim Egypt. The high priest administered them, and if necessary defended them against princely greed. He was assisted by 2, 3, or even 4 classes of prophets and hieroduli who performed worship, taught religion, and managed affairs. Women did not hold equal rank in temples of male deities. There they formed a kind of harem, from which the god took mystic spouses, concubines, maidservants, musicians, and dancers to enliven his feasts. In temples of goddesses, however, women held the chief offices as hierodules, priestesses of Neet, Arthur, or Pahit. The lower offices resemble those of a princely household. Butchers, cooks, pastry cooks, confectioners, weavers, shoemakers, florists, sellers, water carriers, and milk carriers. A temple was a state within a state, and the prince kept its government close, either by investing a son in the chief pontiff's functions or by assuming them himself. Had the prince officiate, masters of ceremonies stood by to prevent ritual errors that would annul the sacrifice, prompting him with the correct gestures, changes of costume, and the words of invocation from a book or tablet. Each sacerdotal college also developed a theology matching the nature and attributes of its god. Its fundamental dogma affirmed the unity of the gnome god, his greatness and sovereignty over all other gods, Egyptian or foreign, whose existence was nonetheless admitted. Each god claimed unity and sovereignty, yet in the gnome's view, the local god was master of them all. He governed the world, kept it in order, and had created it. Not from nothing, for the idea of absolute nothingness did not exist, but by bringing pre-existing elements into play. Those latent elements had always existed, sleeping in the new, the dark primeval waters. In time, the god of each gnome drew them forth, classified them, and made his universe according to his nature. Thus Neet of Sais, a weaver, made the world as warp and woof. Khnummu, the Nile god of the cataracts, modelled creatures from river mud on his potter's wheel. In the eastern delta, the story was different. There the beginning found earth and sky entwined, lovers locked in the new, the god beneath the goddess. On the day of creation, a new god, Shu, rose from the waters, slipped between them, and seizing Nuit, lifted her above his head. The starry body of the goddess stretched west to east. Her hands and feet hung towards the earth. These became 4 pillars of the firmament, each guarded by a god of a neighbouring principality: Osiris or Horus the sparrow hawk over the south pole, Sit over the north, Thoth the west, Sapadi, author of the zodiacal light, over the east. They divided the world into 4 houses, bounded by mountains and by lines intercepting the pillars. Each house belonged to one master alone. Not even the sun might enter or dwell there without permission. Subu, who resisted Shu, is depicted rising from sleep, one leg stretched, the other partly drawn up, his body half moved, his head drooping, one arm lifted to the sky. His effort was checked, struck down by the Creator, and remained petrified in that painful posture. The irregularities of the earth's surface were explained as the mark of his punishment. His sides grew green. Generations passed on his back, but his pain endured. He still complains to heaven, night and day, of the violent separation when Nuit was torn from him. The inundated plains of the delta, the river that furrows and fertilizes them, and the desert sands that threaten them, these sites shaped the early explanations of creation offered by the theologians of Mendes and Butur. In those accounts, the local gods, Osiris, Sit, and Isis, take the center stage. Osiris first stood for the wild, uncertain Nile of earliest times. As men learned to regulate the river, they saw a gentler aspect in him, and soon transformed him into a benefactor of humanity, the supremely good being called Onofri. He was lord of the principality of Didu along the Sebennytic branch of the Nile between the coast marshes and the Wadi Tumilad. That principality had been divided. The two resulting nomes, the 9th and the 16th of the Delta, in pharaonic lists, remained faithful to him, and there he reigned without rival at Busiris as at Mendes. His most famous idol was the Didu, a fetish of 4 superimposed columns that lent its name to the principality. The Didu was given life in the imagination of worshippers and displayed a somewhat grotesque face, big cheeks, thick lips, a necklace at the throat, and a heavy long dress that hid the columnar base. 2 arms cross the breast, one hand holds a whip, the other a crook, the symbols of sovereignty. That may have been Osiris's oldest form. He was also shown as a man, or as rams and bulls, or even as water birds, lapwings, herons, and cranes, which played about the district's lakes.
Isis, the cow or woman with cow's horns, is the goddess we often think inseparable from Osiris. But she had not always belonged to him. Originally an independent deity, she dwelt at Buto among the ponds of Adhu. She had neither husband nor lover, yet she had conceived and borne a son whom she suckled among the reeds, a lesser Horus, called Harsi-Set, Horus the son of Isis, to distinguish him from Haroeras. Early on, she was married to her neighbor Osiris, a union perfectly suited to her nature. She personified the earth, not the world at large, like Cebu with its seas, mountains, deserts, and cultivated land, but the black, luxuriant plain of the delta, where plants, animals, and peoples multiply generation after generation. Who, then, could be more fitting as her partner than Osiris the Nile? The river rises, overflows, lingers upon the soil. Each year it is wedded to the earth, and from that embrace the land springs green and fruitful. So the marriage of river and earth suggested the marriage of the two gods. Osiris wedded Isis and adopted the young Horus. Yet this kindly pair could not account for every natural phenomenon. The eastern delta borders on Arabian solitudes. Many provinces there are fertile only by the labor and vigilance of men. If irrigation slackens, the desert reclaims the land and restores sterility. Set embodied that desert spirit, mountain, stone, and sand, the red and arid ground as opposed to the valley's moist black soil. Often shown on the body of a lion or dog, Set bore a strange head with a slender curved snout and upright square-cut ears. His cloven tail rose like a fork from his loins. He could appear in human form with an animal head, and he was felt to be cruel and treacherous, ever ready to shrivel the harvest with burning breath and to smother Egypt beneath shifting sand. The contrast between Set and the beneficent couple was striking, yet Delta theologians soon gave them a common origin. Cebu had begotten them, Nuit had borne them when the demiurge separated her from her husband, and their births were counted among the days of creation. At first, each god kept to his own half of the world. Set, who had begun alone, took a wife, so that he might not be inferior to Osiris. His companion, Nephthys, showed little initiative, an artificial counterpart to Isis, a second Isis, who bore no children. The sterile desert brought barrenness to her, as to all it touched. Still, she had not given up the wish or the power to bear. Tradition held that she made Osiris drunk, drew him to her without his knowledge, and bore him a son, the jackal Anubis.
When a higher Nile overflows normally dry land, the soil drinks the water and hidden germs spring into life. The gradual invasion of Set's domain by Osiris marks the beginning of the strife. Set rebels at his wrongs, involuntary though the wrong may be. He surprises and treacherously slays his brother, drives Isis into temporary exile among her marshes, and reigns over Osiris's realm as well as his own. His triumph is short. Horus grows up, takes arms, defeats him in many encounters, and sends him into exile. Thus the world's creation brings the destroying and the life-sustaining gods face to face. The history of the world becomes the story of their rivalries and warfare. None of these local conceptions alone explained all aspects of creation or the roles of every god. The priests of Heliopolis took these themes, altered some details, discarded others, added new personages, and constructed a complete cosmogony. Its parts were artfully combined to match the various operations by which the world was drawn from chaos and ordered into its present state. Heliopolis did not play a leading part in political revolutions, yet no city contributed so many mystical ideas or so greatly influenced the development of civilization. Heliopolis was a small town on the plain near the Nile, at the apex of the delta, once surrounded by a high mud-brick wall, traces of which remained into the modern century, though now they have nearly vanished. Today, one obelisk standing in the open plain, a few mounds of debris, scattered blocks and short stretches of crumbling wall alone mark where the city stood. Ka was worshipped there. The Greek name Heliopolis is simply the priest's name translated, Pi-Ra, the city of the sun. Its principal temple, the mansion of the prince, rose about the middle of the enclosure and sheltered the god and the animals in which he became incarnate. The bull Minervus, and sometimes the phoenix. According to an old legend, the wondrous bird appeared only once every 500 years. It was born in the depths of Arabia. When its parents died, it covered the corpse with myrrh and flew with all speed to the temple of Heliopolis to bury it. At first, Ra was the sun itself, the fires that seemed to be lit every morning in the east and to be quenched at evening in the west. And to most people he remained that. Among theologians, however, opinion varied. Some held that the sun's disk was the body the god assumed when he presented himself to worshippers. Others said it represented his active, radiant soul. Many preferred a middle course. The disk was one of his kopriru, a self-manifestation, without deciding whether it was body or soul. They all agreed, though, that the sun's disk had existed in the new before creation. But how could it lie beneath the primordial ocean without drying the waters or being extinguished by them? Heliopan thinkers found an elegant solution. By identifying Ra with Horus and with his right eye, the god needed only to close his eyelid to keep his fires from touching the waters. He was also said to have enclosed his disk in a lotus bud, whose folded petals protected it. The flower opened on the first morning, and from it the god sprang, a child wearing the solar disk on his head. From every angle the theologians distinguished two periods, two modes of the supreme deity. A pre-mundane sun lying inert within the dark waters, and our living, life-giving sun. One branch of the Heliopolis school kept traditional names and images. To the pre-mundane sun they gave a human form and the title Ra, understood in an abstract sense, as creator. The name perhaps from the verb Ra, to give. The living sun is associated with the sparrowhawk and called Haramahuiti,
Horus in the two horizons, a name that marks its function. They summed up the sun's idea in the single name Ra Harmahuiti and an image that grafted Horus' head onto Ra's human body. Other theologians coined new names. The sun before the world was called Tumu, Atumu, creator, and our earthly sun was called Khopri, he who is. Tumu appears as a crowned, robed man, majestic and impassive like the pharaohs. The idea of Khopri as a disk enclosing a scarab, or as a man with a scarab on his head, or as a scarab-headed mummy, grew from the accidental similarity of the names Khopri and Khopiru, the scarab. Over time, these forms and names blended. The scarab of Khopri could sit on Ra's head. The hawk headdress could be moved among them. Complex, compounded names Ra Tumu, Atamu Ra, Ra Tumu Khopri, and Ra Harmahuiti, Tumu, and so on, never became sharply distinct personalities. They were mostly different names for shared aspects or phases of the same divine being.
From this arose a useful idea. The gods were embodiments of the main phases in the sun's life through day and year. Ra symbolized the sun of springtime in the pre-dawn, Harmakhwiti, the morning and summer sun, Atumu, the afternoon and autumn sun, Khopri, the night and winter sun. The people of Heliopolis accepted the new names and images, but they always kept them subordinate to their beloved Ra. Ra never ceased to be the god of the nome. Atumu remained the theologian's god, invoked chiefly by priests, while the common people preferred Ra. Elsewhere, similar consolidations occurred. At Thinis and Sebenitos, Anhuri met the same fate as Ra in Heliopolis. Once identified with the sun, Anhuri and the related Shu, originally twin gods of sky and earth, became a single god in two persons, Anhuri Shu. One half, Anhuri, represented the primordial being. The other, Shu, became the creative sun god who upholds, Shu, the sky. Thus, Turnu, more than Ra, was placed by Heliopolitan priests at the head of their cosmogony as supreme creator and governor. Several versions explained how Tumu passed from inertia to action, from the personage Tumu into the living Ra. The most common told that he suddenly cried across the waters, "Come unto me!" Immediately the lotus unfolded its petals, and Ra appeared at the cup's edge, as a disk, a newborn child, or a disk-crowned sparrowhawk. This refined account probably echoes an older, cruder tradition, in which Ra himself separated Sibu from Nuit to construct the heavens and the earth. But it was doubtless felt that so unseemly an active intervention was beneath the dignity even of an inferior form of the suzerain god. Shu was therefore borrowed for this purpose from the kindred cult of Anhuri, and at Heliopolis, as at Sebenitos, the office of seizing the sky goddess and raising her with outstretched arms was entrusted to him. The violence Nuit suffered at Shu's hands linked the Osirian dogma of Mendes with the solar dogma of Sebenitos. Thus, the tradition explaining the creation of the world was completed by another, the explanation of its division into deserts and fertile lands. Sibu, hitherto concealed beneath the body of his wife, was now exposed to the sun. Osiris and Set, Isis and Nephthys were born, and, falling from the sky, their mother fell upon the earth, their father, and they divided its surface among themselves. Heliopolis doctrine therefore recognized three principal events in creation. First, the dualization of the supreme god and the breaking forth of light. Second, the raising of the sky and the laying bare of the earth. Third, the birth of the Nile and the allotment of Egypt's soil, each event expressed as the manifestation of successive deities. These latter deities already formed a family, father, mother, children, like human families. Learned theologians used this human model to arrange analogous relationships among the rest of the gods, combining them into one lineage. Since Atu-Ra could have no peer, he stood apart in the first rank. It was decided that Shu should be his son, formed out of Atumu himself on the first day of creation by the intensity of the demiurge's own virile energy. Shu, now divine son, in turn begot Sibu and Nuit, the two deities he separated. Until then he had been supposed to have no wife. He might even have brought forth his progeny alone, but, lest a power of spontaneous generation equal to that of the demiurge be ascribed to him, a wife was given him, Tafnuit, his twin sister, born in the same way. This goddess, invented for the occasion, never quite lived. She remained like Nephthys, more a theological entity than a real person. Texts describe her as the pale reflex of her husband. She is a lioness when Shu is a lion, a woman when he is a man, a lioness-headed woman if he is a lion-headed man. She is angry when he is angry, appeased when he is appeased. There is hardly any sanctuary in which he is not worshipped. In short, the pair make one being in two bodies. In the Egyptian phrase, one soul in its two twin bodies. Thus, the Heliopolitans proclaimed creation to be the work of the sun god Atumu-Ra, and of the four pairs of deities descended from him. This is essentially a learned variant of the older doctrine that the universe rests on a sky god, Horus, supported by his four children and their four pillars. Indeed, the four sons of the Heliopolitan cosmogony, Shu, Sibu, Osiris, and Set, were sometimes substituted for the older four gods of the houses of the world. Important differences remain. Instead of appearing together, like the four children of Horus, the Heliopolitan gods are deduced one from another and succeed each other in birth order. They do not share a single uniform attribute of supporter. Each claims faculties and powers required by his condition. Ultimately, each takes a goddess, and the group working at the organization of the world grows to 9. Hence, they are collectively called the Ennead, Peuti Nuturu, the 9 gods, and their head is titled Peuti, the god of the Ennead. When creation was complete, its continued existence was entrusted to countless agencies. The Ennead could not attend personally to every function essential to the regular working of the world, so the Heliopolitan theologians selected 18 deities from Egypt's many feudal cults and formed 2 secondary Enneads. These were regarded as offspring of the Ennead of creation. The first of the secondary Enneads, commonly called the Minor Ennead, recognized as chief Harsiaises, the son of Osiris. Harsiaises was originally an earth god who avenged his father's assassination and his mother's banishment by Sit. In other words, he restored fullness to the Nile and fertility to the Delta. When he was incorporated into Heliopolitan solar religion, his filiation was kept intact as a natural link between the 2 Enneads, though his personality was adjusted to his new theological surroundings. He was identified with Ra through Haroris Harmakis, the older Horus, and the minor Ennead, like the great Ennead, began with a sun god. This assimilation did not grant the younger Horus the full powers of his fictive ancestor. He remained the son of the earth, the everyday sun, while Atumu-Ra remained the pre-mundane, eternal sun. Our knowledge of the 8 other deities of the minor Ennead is imperfect. We do know that these gods chiefly protected the sun against its enemies and helped it follow its course. Harhuditi, the Horus of Edfu, spear in hand, pursues hippopotami and serpents that halt the celestial waters and menace the god. Thoth controls the sunbark by his incantations, while Upawatiti, the dual jackal god of Suyufti, guides and at times tows it across the sky from south to north. A third Ennead seemed to have included Anubis, the jackal, and the 4 funerary genii, the children of Horus, Hapi, Amsit, Tiumatuth, and Kabixinuf. Its office appears to have been the care and defense of the dead sun, the sun by night, while the second Ennead watched over the living sun. The functions of this nocturnal Ennead were obscure and comparatively slight. Theologians didn't bother to represent or enumerate its persons. They invoked it as a whole after the other two, in formulas calling on all the creative and preservative forces, more from conscientious exactitude than from real deference. At the initial impulse of the Lord of Heliopolis, the three combined Enneads set the world in motion and kept it going.
The doctrine of the Heliopolitan Ennead quickly won lasting popularity. It offered a clear, tradition-aligned scheme of creation, and sacerdotal colleges adopted it in turn, adapting it to local patriotism. Each placed its own gnome god at the head of its Ennead as god of the nine, god of the first time, creator of heaven and earth, sovereign of men and of action. Thus, beside the Ennead of Atumu at Heliopolis, there were Enneads of Anhuri at Thynis and Sebenatos, of Menu at Coptos and Panopolis, of Heroiris at Edfu, of Sobku at Ombus, and later of Ptah at Memphis and Ammon at Thebes. Gnomes that worshipped a goddess freely credited her with the part played by Atumu and with spontaneous maternity for Shu and Topnuit. Neith led the Ennead of Sais, Isis that of Buto, Hathor that of Dendera. Few colleges went beyond substituting their feudal god for Atumu. So long as the gnome's god held supreme rank, the rest mattered little. Local theologians left the order of the Ennead's other agents unchanged. Their vanity was unhurt, even when Heliopolitan tradition assigned humble offices to widely worshipped powers such as Osiris, Sibu, and Set. Hermopolis alone refused to adopt the new system wholesale. Hermopolis had long been a ruling city of Middle Egypt. Positioned between the eastern and western branches of the Nile, it maintained ports and customs houses on each arm. Every boat passing paid a toll. The city's treasury was filled not only by the valley's grain and products, but by goods from distant Africa, carried to Siyuf by Sudanese caravans. Thought, the city's god, represented as an ibis or a baboon, was essentially a moon god who measured time, counted days, numbered months, and recorded years. Lunar deities are everywhere credited with varied powers. They command the universe's mysterious forces. They know the sounds, words, and gestures that set those forces in motion, and they teach their worshippers the arts of employing them. Thought was no exception. He was lord of the voice, master of words and books, possessor or inventor of magic writings which nothing in heaven, on earth, or in Hades could resist. He had discovered the incantations that evoke and control the gods. He had transcribed the texts and noted their melodies. He recited them with the true intonation, mahru, which renders them invincible. Anyone, god or man, to whom he imparted these words, and whose voice he made true, smahru, became, like him, master of the universe. Thought achieved creation not by muscular effort, as other cosmogonical gods did, but by formulas, by voice alone, the first time when he awoke in the new. The articulate word and the voice were believed the most potent creative forces. They did not remain immaterial on leaving the lips, but condensed into tangible substance, bodies that were themselves animated, into gods and goddesses who lived or created in turn. By a short phrase, Tumu called forth the gods that order all things. His "Come unto me," uttered loudly on the day of creation, evoked the sun from within the lotus. Thought opened his lips, and the voice that issued became an entity. Sound solidified into matter, and by the simple emission of voice, the four gods who preside over the four houses of the world came forth alive from his mouth, without bodily effort or even spoken evocation. Creation by voice is in thought almost as refined as the idea of creation by word, replacing creation by muscular force. Sound stands to words as a mere whistle stands to spoken orders. It is speech reduced to pure abstraction. First, men believed the Creator made the world with a word. Then they thought he made it by sound. The conception that he made it by thought does not seem to have occurred to the theologians. It was told of Hermopolis, and later accepted even by the Heliopolitans, that the separation of Nuit and Sibu took place at a spot on the city's site where Sibu climbed the mound on which the feudal temple was later built to better sustain the goddess and uphold the sky. The idea of a creative council of 5 gods so prevailed at Hermopolis that the city received in remote antiquity the name the House of the 5. Its temple was called the Abode of the 5 into late Egyptian times, and its prince, the hereditary high priest of thought, counted among his chief titles the Great One of the House of the 5. The 4 couples who had helped Atumu were identified with the 4 auxiliary gods of thought, and the Council of 5 became a great Hermopolitan Ennead, but not without strange metamorphoses. Though they had been artificially grouped around Atumu, each auxiliary god retained distinct traits preventing confusion. Creation required considerable physical manifestation, so each god preserved the individuality needed to produce the expected effects. Being born one of another, they were made to pair with goddesses capable of bearing offspring. Yet these 4 auxiliary gods of Hermopolis acted by a single means, the voice. Having come forth from the master's mouth, they created and perpetuated the world by voice. Apparently they could have done without goddesses, but marriage was imposed by their identification with the corresponding Heliopolitan gods. In consequence, their wives possessed only a show of life, almost devoid of reality. As these 4 gods worked like their master thought, they bore his form and reigned with him as so many baboons. Associated with thought, the 8 Heliopolitan divinities took on the character and appearance of the 4 Hermopolitan gods into which they were merged. They were often shown as 8 baboons surrounding the supreme baboon, or as 4 pairs of gods and goddesses without distinctive attributes, or finally, as 4 pairs of gods and goddesses whose names corresponded roughly to the Heliopolitan groups. Nu, Nuit, answering to Shu Tafnuit, Hahu, Hechet, to Sibu and Nuif, Kahu Kakit to Osiris and Isis, Ninu Ninit to Set and Nephthys. There was rarely reason to invoke them separately. They were addressed collectively as the 8, Khmunu, and on their account Hermopolis took the name Khmunu, the city of the 8. In time, they lost even the little individuality left to them and were fused into a single being the texts call Khumninu, the god 8. By degrees, the Ennead of thought was reduced to 2 practical terms: participate in the adoration of the king. According to a custom common by Greco-Roman period, sculptures sometimes carved the feet of gods with jackal heads, a way of realizing a familiar Egyptian metaphor that likened a swift runner to the jackal roaming the country. As sacerdotal colleges adopted the Heliopolitan doctrine, so they in time adopted the doctrines of Hermopolis as well. Amun, for example, came to preside just as easily over the 8 baboons as over the 4 independent couples of the primitive Ennead. The process of adaptation was essentially the same in each case, and would have been simple enough if the divinities involved had remained solitary beings. Then one needful change for a city would have been only the substitution of a single name in the Heliopolitan list, leaving the number of the Ennead unchanged.
But these deities had been transformed into triads. They could no longer be treated as single units to be slotted into some established Ennead without prior arrangement. Each god's 2 chosen companions had to be adopted too, and the single Thoth or single Atu had to be replaced by the 3 patrons of the nome, thus turning 9 into 11 names. The constitution of the triad, however, made such adjustments possible. Fathers and sons often became one and the same personage when it suited theological needs. One parent of a pair would commonly predominate and nearly efface the other. Sometimes the goddess disappeared behind her husband. Sometimes the god existed merely as an explanation for the offspring of the goddess, his only title to his place being that he was her husband.
two persons so intimately connected soon blended into one and were described as two faces, masculine and feminine, of a single being. The father was one with the son, and the father was one with the mother. Therefore, the mother was one with the son as she was one with the father. The three gods of a triad could thus be resolved into one god in three persons. By this device, placing a triad at the head of an Ennead became simply a roundabout way of placing a single god there. The three persons counted as one, and the 11 names amounted to the 9 canonical deities. So the Theban Ennead, Amun, Mount, Khonsu, Shu, Tafnoit, Sibu, Nuit, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, is, despite its apparent irregularity, as valid as the typical Ennead. In such groupings, Isis may be duplicated by goddesses of like nature, Hathor, Selkit, Taninit, and still be but one. Osiris brings his son Horus, who gathers around him other gods who play the role of divine son in other triads. Theologians had various practices to keep the number of persons in an Ennead at 9, whatever the roster might include. Supernumeraries were thrown in like the shadows at Roman suppers, guests brought unannounced, whose presence altered nothing of the provision or the arrangements for the formally invited. Thus remodeled, the Heliopolitan Ennead adapted readily to sacerdotal caprices and even profited from the triad's readiness to expand. Over time, the Heliopolitan account of the origin of Shu and Tafnuit came to seem too crude. Allowing for the license of the pharaonic imagination, the notion that Atum had produced his twin children by a spontaneous emission was unnecessarily coarse when an alternative explanation was at hand. By placing the god in a triad, the double birth could be explained according to ordinary laws of life. The solitary Atum of the older doctrine gave place to Atum the husband and father. He had 2 wives, Usasit and Nebtot-Kit, but their personalities were faintly marked. No one chose between them, and each might be named as the mother of Shu and Tafnuit. This somewhat naive system of combination had far-reaching consequences for Egyptian religion. Once Shu was transformed into the divine son of the Heliopolitan triad, he could be assimilated with the divine sons of other triads that replaced Atum at the heads of provincial Enneads. Thus, Horus, the son of Isis at Buto, Arihosnophir, the son of Nit at Sais, Khnumu, the son of Hathor at Esne, were each identified in time with Shu, the son of Atum, and lost their individuality in him. Repetition of the claim that the divine sons of triads were identical with Shu, as occupying the second rank of the Ennead, led to a broader notion. Many minds, the third person in any divine family was everywhere and always Shu under another name. When the sacerdotal colleges finally admitted that Atum and Shu, father and son, were one, all divine sons were therefore identical with Atum. And as each divine son was one with his parents, those parents themselves became identified with Atum. Reasoned this way, Egyptian theology moved toward the conception of divine oneness already suggested by the Hermopolitan Ogdoad. In fact, they reached it. Monuments show that in relatively early times, theologians were busy uniting in a single person the prerogatives once ascribed to many beings. Yet, this unity was not like the God of modern monotheisms. No Egyptian god was ever simply spoken of as the God in an absolute sense. Atum might be the one and only God, Nutir Wai Waiti, in Heliopolis, and Huri Shu might be the one and only God at Sebennytos or Thinis. The unity of Atum did not conflict with that of Anhuri Shu. Each was the sole deity in his own domain, but not in the other. The ever-present feudal spirit, jealous and local,
prevented the broader dogma from triumphing over local cults and covering the whole land. Egypt had as many sole deities as she had large cities or important temples. She never accepted the idea of a single, sole God, beside whom there is none other.